now we're ready to punch holes in our book covers. So if you look at this book, you can see that in the cover, the holes for the sewing stations are punched through the top of the cover. So we're going to punch holes that are about 1/4 inch away from the spine edge of the cover material. Before we get to the actual punching, we're going to have to make a new jig or alter the jig that we use to punch the holes in the signatures to make that work for punching the holes in our cover. So you can use whichever one you use to punch the holes in the signatures. So, well, let's say if you were starting with the graph paper. The graph paper is really simple to adapt to using for the covers because we already have these grid lines. And so on my graph paper, I know that each line is 1/4 inch. So I'm just going to use the point where these two lines intersect as the position of my holes. And so I know that it's going to be along this first 1/4 inch line at a point that intersects with the mark that corresponds with where I punched holes in the signatures. So I'm just circling those. If you were just using a plain piece of paper, you can use the piece that you cut notches into. That's totally fine. We're gonna have to just create this 1/4 inch line here. So I'm gonna just measure 1/4 inch from the edge, and I'm using the same edge where my notches are cut. So measuring out 1/4 inch, just using a ruler. I like to make 3 points. So I measured 1/4 inch here. Now I'm gonna measure 1/4 inch here, and maybe I'll measure 1/4 inch here. And then I'm just gonna join these lines with a straight edge and draw a line there. So I'm kind of connecting my 3 points and then drawing a straight line. So I just used this as a straight edge. If you're sure that this is straight and this is a right angle here, then you can also just use a triangle and line the triangle up with the end of your strip of paper and then with the marks that you made, and do the exact same thing and then draw a line there. So whatever type of tool you have, you can make it work for yourself. And now I need to extend where my notches are so that those points intersect with the line that I just drew down the length of this strip. So for that, I am going to use my triangle since I have it. And I'm just lining up the bottom edge of my triangle with the edge of the jig. And then I'm lining up the vertical part of the triangle with the point of the notch. And then I'm just going to draw a line that creates an intersecting point with the long line that I drew down the length of my jig. And so I'm just going to do that for each one of these notches. And so this should ensure that the sewing stations that we're punching in the top of the covers should correspond as closely as possible with the sewing stations that we punched in the signatures. So now that we have this ready, we can go on to making the holes in the covers. So now it's time to punch the holes into our covers. Here I have 3 different types of covers. A soft cover, this is just a cyanotype that was made on a piece of heavy duty like watercolor paper. So it's just thick paper. And I have the cover that I made using the book board and the book cloth. So that's like a little thicker and a little harder to punch a hole through than this. And then I have my Lego plates, which are hard plastic. And then we're also going to need the jigs that we just made. So I have a different jig for each one of my books here. Whether you used graph paper or if you were using a plain paper jig and drew your lines on it, we'll need that. And then we're gonna need some kind of a tool for punching holes. The type of material that your cover is made out of is going to determine what type of tool you're going to use. So if you have something that's soft, like a heavy paper or like postcard, or we can probably just use the same type of awl that we used for our pages. If you have something that is a thicker material, like the cover made with the book board or something similar to that, then we're going to use a heavy duty awl with a hammer. The hammer is going to help us to punch through. And this heavy duty awl is nice and strong. If I used this awl for this, first of all, it might make a hole that's too small, but also this needle tip might bend under the force of the hammer. If you have something that's a harder material, so like something made of plastic, or maybe if you're using like wood or some other kind of hard material, I know that I would never be able to punch a hole through this, especially because this is a brittle material. So if I tried to do this, it would probably crack the plastic. If it was another type of hard material like wood, like maybe the awl would go into it, but it probably wouldn't make a very nice hole all the way through. So for this, I'm going to use a drill with a 1/16 or a 5/32 drill bit. So it's just like a really thin drill bit that is like a little bit thicker than my bookbinding needle. If you're using a drill or if you're using the awl with a hammer, I would also suggest that you have a piece of wood or something else that you can put down on your table so that you don't make holes in your work surface. Here's version 1. These are heavyweight watercolor paper. So this would also work with anything that's like made of cardstock or if you're using fabric. So I'm going to use my light duty awl and I'm going to use the jig that I created for this material. I'm going to do one cover at a time and I'm going to place the guide right here. I'm going to tape this in place with some low-tack masking tape. And then I'm just going to take my awl and I'm going to line it up with the marks that I made and I'm just going to punch through just like that, just applying enough pressure so that the awl goes through. And since I have this wood underneath, I can feel that the awl is going into the wood, but you can also just check and make sure that it's coming through the back of your cover material. And I'm just going to go ahead and do the same thing all the way down the length of the cover. Okay, so now when we move to the second cover, I can even just use the first cover as a guide as long as I put them really flush together, and I can just punch through the holes that I already made really carefully. So that's the soft cover. Next, I'm going to punch holes in my cover that I made with bookboard. For this, I'm going to use my jig that I drew the lines on myself. And so again, I'm just going to start with one. And I'm going to line up my jig into the corner of my cover. And I'm going to tape it in place with some masking tape. Make sure that it is as precise as possible. And for this one, I'm going to use my heavy duty awl and then I'm going to use my hammer. And I'm going to line up the point of the awl with the intersecting lines that I drew that correspond with my original sewing stations. And I'm lining up the point there and I'm going to hold it down firmly with my left hand, and then I'm going to take the hammer and just give 2 good taps. And that should be enough to put it through the material, and you can see that it has made a hole that comes through to the other side. And I'm just going to do that all the way down the length of the cover. So now I have holes down the length of my cover. If you're not sure if the hole is the right size, you can also take one of your needles and just double check that it goes through. You want it to go through pretty easily without too much trouble. If it is really hard to get it through, then you just need to go back with the awl again. with this material, because it's thick, if you look on this side, you can see that there's kind of like this blowout shape that happens from when the awl goes through. So we don't want to punch the holes in the second cover from the inside, because then we'll have that blowout on the outside. If the blowout is happening on the inside, that's okay, because it'll just get covered up when we sew the pages. When we move on to the second cover, it's really important that we think of this idea of mirroring the jig. So on this one, I had the jig lined up like this, and I could see my pencil marks from above. That's how I knew where to punch the holes. But now with this next cover, I don't want to just take this and turn it upside down, because then the holes might not be perfectly even. They might be slightly off from one another. And especially if you have an asymmetrical pattern, then it's gonna make it upside down and your covers won't work together. So we wanna like mirror it. And so I like to position them like this and then kind of flip this like I'm turning a page. So I'm flipping it over so that now it's mirroring its position on the first cover. And again, I can just position it super precisely and tape it down. And I can't see my pencil marks because they're on the other side, but I can see where the holes were punched. So that's what I'm going to use as my guide this time. And I'm just going to punch my holes again. That for that one. And now I'm going to punch the holes or drill the holes through my Lego plates. And so again, I'm just going to do one at a time. And I'm going to take my jig and position it. Now, when I'm doing the Lego plates, there's a couple of different ways I could do this. If you're drilling through a material that's perfectly flat, like a piece of wood, you can just tape this jig down and drill right through the paper into your wood or into whatever other material. But if you have something like this that's bumpy, it might actually help to transfer the marks on with a marker. You can either punch holes in your jig first and use this tape it in place and transfer those points through using a marker. So I'm just like pressing this marker into those little points that I just made with my awl. And then I'll have those dots transferred onto my Lego plate. So that works really well if you're using something like the Lego plate that has these kind of incremental elements to it. You can also just position your guide at the proper place and just transfer marks over with a marker or a pencil that correspond with your sewing stations. And now once I have the marks transferred onto my material, or I've taped my jig down in the proper place, some materials might be sent spinning by the drill bit, so it might be helpful to tape it down, or you could even clamp it down. And then I'm going to line up the bottom of my drill bit with my marker mark, and I'm just going to slowly drill through. And I'm going to just do that all the way down the length of my cover, just like with the awl. Once I've drilled my holes, I'm just going to double check that they match up. At this point, you should have some signatures to use for your interior pages that have holes punched through the folds for sewing stations, as well as your 2 covers that also have holes punched through. As long as you're up to this point, we're ready to move on to sewing.